Hello, and welcome to the third program in our 2024 Sawtooth Forum and Lecture Series, brought to you by the Sawtooth Interpretive and Historical Association, or SEHA, if you're cool. I'm Morgan McCulley, a historic specialist working for SEHA here at the Stanley Museum, which is behind us. And I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that here in Sawtooth Country, we are in the unceded and traditional lands of the Agadeka and Dugadeka bands of the Shoshone-Bannock tribes. We pay respect and honor to the tribes and all indigenous people who have continuously stewarded this land for generations. This program is free of charge thanks to our primary sponsors, Redfish Lake Lodge and the McNichol family, in memory of Roland McNichol, who was an avid series attendee and steward of the Sawtooths. We thank our sponsors for their continued support. As you may know, the association is a member-based nonprofit. Our mission is to protect and advance the natural and cultural history of Idaho's Sawtooth Salmon River country through preservation and education. Our operations are funded by donations, grants, memberships, and book and map sales at our bookstores, located inside 9 ranger stations, at the Redfish Visitor Center and Gallery, and here at the Stanley Museum. We hope you will consider supporting our work by making a donation tonight or by becoming an annual member. Would any current members of SEHA in attendance please raise your hands? That's like the whole audience. Thank you for your support. Tonight we are excited to hear from Greg Kaltenecker, who will be presenting Bald Eagles, Celebrating a Successful Recovery. Greg is the co-founder and director of the Intermountain Bird Observatory. He received his Bachelor's of Science in Biology and his Master's of Science in Raptor Biology from Boise State. Greg's research passion is bird migration, and his lifelong pursuit is to educate the public about birds, science, and conservation. He believes that a strong public community presence is critical to being an effective scientist, and that the easiest way to accomplish conservation is through active public engagement. Join me in welcoming Greg.
Thanks, Morgan. Thanks, everybody, for coming. It's a real honor to be invited to come speak to this group. I think this is the second time, maybe the third, that I've spoken to this group over the years. I think the last time was 20-some years ago, but it's great to be here. It's great to see this view again. And I don't know about you guys, are your eyes a little watery today? Your throat a little dry? So is mine. So I apologize if I cough or need to get a drink. But so I'm Greg. I'm the director currently of the Intermountain Bird Observatory. I helped found that organization some 30 years ago. It's a Boise State University program, and so I've been affiliated with Boise State pretty much since I started my undergraduate career. I teach, I do research, I mentor students, and basically have a great time doing all of those things. And I worked with bald eagles for more than 10 years of my life, very, very early on in my career when bald eagles were still endangered. They were on the endangered species list. I studied bald eagles both during the winter and during the spring breeding season. And I started as an undergraduate, I guess. During the summer times, I studied a couple of different bald eagle nests down on the Boise River system. And those projects, through my connections and through the professor that I had, actually the professor I had, Dr. Mark Bayshard, he was a great mentor to me, and those projects turned into a master's project studying bald eagles and bald eagle wintering distribution on the upper Boise River, and that project was funded by the Forest Service. And so one led to another, and for more than 10 years I studied bald eagles early in my career, and I really look back. I had a lot of fun putting these notes together, kind of bringing back all those old memories, you know, from early on in my career. So, as you guys know, the bald eagle is our national symbol. It was adopted as our national symbol in 1782. I think if you talk to just about any American and ask them what bald eagles mean to them, they're going to say, you know, freedom, right? They'll say things like freedom, strength, and resilience. And I think that's true. I think the bald eagle as a species really does represent, represent those things. And so I am proud to live in Idaho and live in a place where we can see bald eagles just about any day of the year. John told me one just flew over. He wasn't sure if it was a bald eagle or a golden eagle, but as he was standing out there talking, one flew over. So just about any day in Idaho, just about anywhere in Idaho, you can see a bald eagle, and that's one of the things that I love about the state. So it was estimated that in the early days, during the colonial period, even before we became a country, it was estimated there were as many as 100,000 nesting pairs of bald eagles in North America. And I think you all kind of generally know the story. Several things contributed to their decline over the years. Habitat loss, mostly from deforestation, development, conversion to urban areas, conversion to cities, conversion to agriculture, removed habitat. And anytime you remove habitat, this is going to lead to loss of prey. When you have loss of prey, we saw huge declines in fish populations, especially anadromous fish. We saw huge declines in waterfowl numbers. That's another favorite prey item of bald eagles, from market gunning. So when you lose prey populations, obviously the predators that prey on those populations are going to decline. And so this decline's probably started in the mid-1800s, 1850s, something like that, and continued for the next 100 years. In 1940, we were aware of these declines. We were aware that the bald eagles were slated to go in danger. They were really, their numbers were low. They were on their way down. And so in 1940, we enacted the Bald Eagle Protection Act. A few years later, we added golden eagles to that act, and it's still around today. It still has a lot of teeth in terms of protection. That's the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act. That was in 1940. And then World War II came along, and as many of you might know, kind of as a product of World War II, this chemical called DDT emerged, and it was a pesticide. It was used for all kinds of things, in agriculture. And it worked great. It worked great. I've talked to a number of folks who were around, back in those days to use DDT, and they said it was fantastic. I mean, it really worked to control pests. And so, unfortunately, though, for birds, it didn't work so great. And DDT does not break down in the environment, and so it does what we call bioaccumulate, and which means that it goes up the food chain as organisms eat other organisms that have DDT in it. It just goes up the food chain until you get to the top, and the top level predators ended up with very, very large concentrations of DDT. And if you're a bird, DDT acts to thin your eggshells, and we saw eggshell thinning that was so severe that basically birds like bald eagles could no longer nest. They could no longer, naturally reproduce. And so this is what really put bald eagles over the edge, starting in the mid-40s. And for the next several decades, we just saw, precipitous declines in bald eagle numbers. And it wasn't just bald eagles, it was all of the top predatory birds. So brown pelicans was another species that was on the endangered species list. Peregrine falcons, as you all may know, was another one that was endangered. Birds like osprey, loons, especially loons around the Great Lakes in the Great Lake region. Loons were another species that were severely impacted by DDT. Birds like cormorants as well. And as you may well know, all of those species have recovered and are doing great. And so it's a really cool success story, I think, and one that I want to talk about tonight. And I think one of the biggest factors in terms of recovery of bald eagles and these other species was we finally recognized these detrimental effects of DDT in the environment. And in the early 60s, DDT was banned. So it was, trying to see in my notes. So at the lowest point, it was estimated there were as few as 400 nesting pairs of bald eagles. So they had gone from 100,000 nesting pairs to as few as just a few more, over 400. And literally in the 1960s, bald eagles were in danger of going extinct. Even before the Endangered Species Act was enacted, in 1967, bald eagles were listed under a precursor to the Endangered Species Act, and that was the Endangered Species Preservation Act. And then in 1972, we banned DDT. We banned use of DDT. And I think probably that was the largest contributing factor to their recovery, and still is today. DDT, it breaks down pretty rapidly to DDE, and you can still find it in the environment today. I worked on a project down near Nampa, Idaho, at the Deer Flat National Wildlife Refuge, and we were actually sampling drains, kind of input drains coming off of agricultural land, and there was one on the south side of Lake Lowell that was hot for DDE. So either it was still being used there or had just been used in such great quantities that it's still there. I mean, it's still in the environment. So in 1978, we listed the bald eagle under the Endangered Species Act. And as you guys may well know, the Endangered Species Act, there's 3 categories of protection. A species can be endangered, and if a species is endangered, that means it's in danger of going extinct. A species can be threatened, and that means that species is in danger of becoming endangered. Okay, or you can be a candidate species. And what a candidate species is, it's kind of like this the triage concept. In war, during a bloody battle, you have to go and find the wounded, and you have to decide which wounded people you're going to treat first. And so maybe you come up on a fellow with his hand blown off next to somebody with their legs blown off. So who are you going to treat first? You're going to treat the person that's most severely injured first, because they're in the most danger of dying. And so it's this triage concept that we use to kind of determine what species get protection under the Endangered Species Act. And candidate species really get no protection under the ESA, but oftentimes they get the most in terms of actions, on the ground and in the field by state and federal agencies, by private landowners, by industry, because everyone agrees they don't want the species to be listed under the Endangered Species Act. So there's a term that the Fish and Wildlife Service uses for candidate species. They say, yes, it's warranted. It may be warranted that they be listed under the Endangered Species Act, but listing is precluded because there are more higher priority species, ahead of this one. And so I try that on my wife once in a while. When she says, "Hey, Greg, the front lawn is a little tall," and I say, that's warranted but precluded, Dee. Where was I going with that? I lost my train of thought. So anyway, bald eagles were listed as endangered in 1978. And the Endangered Species Act is a pretty amazing piece of legislation, I think. It protects not just species. The Endangered Species Act can protect species. It can protect subspecies. It can protect, you know, individual populations, even individual runs of salmon and things like that. So I teach a lot about the Endangered Species Act in my wildlife management course down at Boise State, and I still think it's, you know, one of the best pieces of legislation that we have to protect endangered species. And the whole premise is that the legislation is set up to protect ecosystems that those species rely on. So when a species is listed, a recovery plan is developed for that species. In the recovery plan, it has recovery goals. Usually they're population goals, so in terms of how many breeding pairs and in what regions. The recovery plan usually, you know, states methods that can be used or that should be used to try and recover the species. And really the whole premise is collaboration. Collaboration between all of the federal agencies, between federal agencies and state agencies, and between those public agencies and either individuals or industry as well. And so really this earlier work that I did with bald eagles was part of this recovery plan. What I did during the summer times was I would be assigned one nest, and it would be my job to go to that nest to find an observation point that was a ways away where I could set up a telescope and watch that nest and that breeding pair and try and identify exactly what habitat was critical to them, what, you know, where the nest tree was, where the perch trees were that they used every day. I tried to identify what they ate, what their prey species were, what threats might be within that territory. I tried to identify how big the territory was, which you can usually do by seeing, you know, how far away from that nest they protect it from other birds of prey, other eagles, and things like that. And so really that was part of this recovery plan, was to study the eagles that were left, find out, you know, what it really was that they needed to survive, and then make recommendations. So each one of these nests that I studied, I would end up writing a nest site management plan, and then that nest site management plan, I would present these recommendations, and they were meant to be recommendations for best practices for management. Sometimes they weren't always that practical, sometimes they weren't always followed, but that was the goal, you know, under this Endangered Species Act and under this recovery process, was to at least identify best management practices for each nest. And in the end, all of these things worked. I think banning DDT was probably the biggest factor, you know, in bald eagles recovering. But all of these other attempts, you know, I think really worked. The collaboration between agencies, the protection of individual nest sites, protection of winter roost sites, and you know, wintering areas and things like that. It all worked. And in 1995, bald eagles were downlisted. They were downlisted from endangered, which is, remember, in danger of becoming extinct, to threatened. And not too long after that, less than 10 years later, in 2007, they were actually completely removed from protection of the Endangered Species Act. And at that time, it was estimated there were about 10,000, just under 10,000 breeding pairs. Just a few years later, in 2009, it was estimated there were 30,000 breeding pairs and more than 70,000 individuals. And the most recent data I could find was from 2019, and in 2019, 71,467 pairs That's the estimate. Now, how do they get an estimate that close? I don't know. I'm not a a modeler or anything like that. But it's estimated over 316,000 individual eagles now, are alive in North America. And so it's been one of the greatest, in my opinion, one of the greatest success stories for the Endangered Species Act. Brown pelican is another one, another win. It's probably been one of the best and most well-known wins of the Endangered Species Act as well. And I really think, we need those. If you ask the average person what they think about the Endangered Species Act, most people will tell you they don't like it. They don't like it because it halts progress, it gets in the way of this project or that project. But in my opinion, it's one of the best tools that we have. It may be clunky, it may not work great all of the time, but it's one of the best tools we have to protect those ecosystems that endangered species, rely on. So even though they're off the Endangered Species Act, they still have great protection, not only under the Bald and Golden Eagle Protection Act, but also, because they're a migratory bird, they're protected under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. And so you can't harm them, you can't harm their nest, you can't trade in their feathers or body parts. All those things are still outlawed, they're still illegal, they're still controlled under those other two pieces of legislation. So I also did a lot of wintertime bald eagle work, and since 1986 there has been an effort nationwide to count bald eagles during the wintertime on all major wintering areas. Each state is divided up into multiple different routes. I think there's a total of there's 844 routes in North America during the wintertime. These midwinter bald eagle counts are all done on the same day or the same 2 days. There's about a 1 week window, but there's a target that these routes are all done. We try and accomplish these routes in 1 or 2 days during the winter. It's usually the early January. It usually cuts our winter vacation short because I have to get back to do these midwinter bald eagle counts. Idaho has 78 different routes, and each one of those routes is divided up into different surveys. There's 1,476 survey routes in Idaho on these 78 different routes. And so every 10 years or so, the data from these midwinter counts are analyzed, and they're a little bit easier to count during the wintertime because they're more gregarious in the winter. They're not, solitary. They're not nesting on, they're not in their nesting territories. And so it's a little bit easier to get an estimate of populations. And from 1986 to 2000, bald eagle populations were growing at 1.9% per year. So they were just growing steadily, 1.9% per year. The last time these data were analyzed, between 2000 and 2010, actually they were analyzed the whole, from 86 to 2010, populations were only growing about 0.6%. So the last decade, maybe a little more than a decade, they're still increasing. Bald eagle numbers are still increasing, but not as fast as they were kind of right after recovery and right after delisting. And why? I don't think anybody really knows, but, and it's not everywhere either. I mean, most places in the nation, we are seeing, increasing trends. But down south, in the southern states, they're actually decreasing. The last analysis showed they were decreasing by about 0.8% per year. In the southwest, the southwestern states, it's more like 2.2% per year. So there are certain areas where bald eagle numbers, are not growing. They're actually going the other direction. And like I say, we don't really know why. It's thought that, we could just be reaching maximum population density in some of these areas. And this is a natural population regulation going on within their populations. But really, it's been a great success story. I think bald eagle numbers are continuing to increase, and they're going to continue to increase as time goes on. So I want to talk a little bit about bald eagle life history. As you know, they're one of our largest predatory birds. They do eat primarily fish, but also carrion, especially in the wintertime. They love to eat, or they love to find, dead ungulates, so deer, elk, especially in the west here, where we have these elevational migrations of ungulates. Ungulates end up down on rivers and reservoirs in the valleys, and there's natural mortality during the wintertime. Those types of food resources definitely attract large numbers of bald eagles. Bald eagles are also attracted during the wintertime by large numbers of waterfowl. So wherever you find lots of waterfowl, you're going to find lots of bald eagles. One of the biggest winter counts in the state of Idaho is along the Snake River, kind of the lower Snake, where it comes into Brownlee Reservoir, where there's lots and lots of waterfowl. There's hundreds of bald eagles that are counted on those routes during the midwinter counts. So they love their waterfowl, and actually in some of the southern states, coots are their preferred meal. They love to chase coots, and I've watched them chase coots before. It's really interesting to see how they catch a coot. Coots dive, and every time they dive, the eagle can't catch them, but the eagle stays above and keeps harassing, kind of like a Harrier jet, keeps harassing and making the coot dive and dive and dive, and before long the coot can't hold its breath anymore and has to come to the surface, and the bald eagle grabs them. I've seen that with my naked eyes, with my bare eyes, right there on the Snake River at Swan Falls. It's a pretty amazing thing to see. So I did a lot of my work on the Boise River. You guys familiar with where Featherville is? Featherville is on the South Fork of the Boise. It's above Anderson Ranch Reservoir. One of the nests that I watched was just below Featherville, right on the South Fork of the Boise. And that pair, there was a period during the spring, right when their eggs hatched and their young, needed prey the most, they took ground squirrels. And that was the most common prey that they brought back to the nest, was ground squirrels. And a little later in the summer, they would switch to fish. But anyway, so fish, carrion, waterfowl, different types of rodents for sure. And their diet actually changes. We see a big diet shift between winter and summer. During the summertime, I think it is true they eat fish more. During the winter, though, that's not necessarily true. I mean, they may travel in the winter to find large concentrations of fish, but they're just as likely to travel to find large concentrations of waterfowl and carrion. Where was I going to tell the story? Might as well tell it here, right? So I worked in Klamath Falls for a while. In Klamath Falls, it's right next to Lower Klamath National Wildlife Refuge. It's a huge concentration of waterfowl in the winter, in the fall and winter. And actually bald eagles travel there from all over the western U.S. This is one of the largest concentrations of bald eagles that we can find. 500 to 1,000 birds on a communal roost there. And I was actually doing a project on waterfowl, but at the time I would notice all of these bald eagles, and I can remember seeing 250, 300 bald eagles all at once in a field that was flooding. The agricultural practices there are such that during the wintertime, after they harvest, they plow their fields, and then there's enough water, at least there was at the time, that they would flood these fields. I'm not exactly sure why they were flooding the fields in the fall, but they would flood these fields, and all of the voles would be racing away from this running water. And so right at the edge of the running water, right at the edge of the flooding water, hundreds of bald eagles, shoulder to shoulder, just like grabbing these wolves as they came out of the field. It was the most amazing thing I think I've ever seen in terms of you know, eagle prey. And eagles, they can be fantastic, aggressive predators, and then they can be kind of lazy too, sometimes. But actually, you know, everything about these birds changes from winter to summer. During the summertime, they're mostly solitary, or they're in pairs, and those pairs are breeding. Those pairs are very territorial. They don't want other eagles, whether it's their own offspring from the previous year or other adult eagles. They will chase them out of their territory and chase them out of sight. I mean, I've seen eagles chase, you know, another bald eagle over a ridge, and you know, as far as I could see through my telescope, till it's out of sight. They are very, very territorial, and hence birds like that, it's very difficult to know how many there are. It's very difficult to survey them because they're so spread out. But in the wintertime, they completely switch. They become very gregarious. They follow the food resources wherever they are. They roost communally, which means they find a place to go at night where they can all sit in the same tree, or the same tree stand, the same group of trees. It's often a place that has a little microclimate. You know, maybe it's a denser stand of trees. Maybe it's you know, a little drainage up, you know, up on a mountain or something like that, where it's a little bit warmer, where they're out of the wind, where they're out of the elements. And those winter roosts are usually centrally located among, you know, the food resources. And so it's often thought that the eagles roost communally and are kind of more communal during the wintertime because food resources are more scarce, and they can see who's coming into the roost that has a full crop, and maybe, oh, maybe tomorrow I'll follow that guy, right, to find where the food is. And so during my master's work, actually, I was working with the Forest Service to survey bald eagles in the upper part of the Boise River drainage. So from Lucky Peak Dam, upriver, up the North Fork, the Middle Fork, and the South Forks of the Boise. And we were just really trying to figure out where eagles were. And we would see these eagles, you know, out on the reservoirs, especially Lucky Peak and Arrow Rock reservoirs. Anderson is kind of a different story there because that's a tailwater stream. There's a dam. There were a lot of eagles on the South Fork of the Boise right below the dam because it stayed open during the wintertime. But we would see all these eagles around Lucky Peak and Arrow Rock reservoirs. This was when those reservoirs used to freeze every winter. And they would be eating, you know, carrion. They'd be eating deer and elk that had died out on the ice. And we couldn't figure out where they were coming from because they certainly weren't on the river down below Lucky Peak. They weren't on the river down through town. There were just a few down there, and we couldn't figure out where they were. And I finally found this communal roost. It was up off of Moores Creek. It was a 2-hour hike to get to this roost during the wintertime, and it was just as I described. Like if you look behind us here, that little valley, that little timbered valley, it was a really small, protected timbered valley. Had a bunch of dead trees, a bunch of big dead trees in it. And I remember when I found that, I was so relieved. I hiked up in there, and I found 50 bald eagles on this roost, which is more than I had ever seen during my surveys of the reservoirs, more than we'd ever seen, you know, on the Boise River down through town. And I remember that was a big win, for not only for me, you know, personally, but it was a huge win for the Forest Service to really find out what was going on. And the interesting thing about that roost was those eagles could go 4 different directions depending on where the prey was. They could go up the reservoirs, they could go into the foothills and look for carrion, they could go over the hill and down into the valley, down by Boise and down along the Boise River. So it was, again, centrally located, a microclimate, and that was really neat to find that. Another thing they eat, you know, they're not above eating carrion, you know, but it's not always natural carrion. There used to be a livestock processing facility south of Boise that would, I guess they would take all of the things they weren't going to use, and then they would put those out in a field. And boy, those eagles found that pretty quickly, and they would go from the roost and make a straight line to that processing facility out on kind of South Cole Road, south of Boise. So that's the story. That drainage where that roost was called Dead Dog Creek. That sticks in my mind. Dead Dog Creek. So, nesting. During the nesting season, they nest in trees mostly, but they'll also nest on cliffs. They'll nest on structures. They'll nest on light poles and buildings. Not very much, but sometimes they do. You know, ospreys tend to do that a lot more than bald eagles. They'll nest on the ground if there's nothing else available for them to nest on. They typically like to nest on a water body, you know, because fish are their preferred prey. And from what I've seen, all the nests that I studied, they like to be able to sit on their nest or near it, you know, in the nest tree or maybe 1 or 2 trees away and see the main foraging areas. Again, like I said, they can be voracious predators and they can be a little lazy too. So why not be able to see your main foraging areas, you know, from your nest? And so that seems to be common, but now I think as densities are increasing, probably those best nesting sites are becoming more and more limited, and so now we see eagles nesting further and further and further away from water bodies. You know, where they have to fly, you know, miles even to get to those water bodies to feed. They're not like osprey. Osprey, you can always tell an osprey nest because it's in the very tip top of a tree. Bald eagles rarely do that. They like to build their nest below the canopy, a little ways, maybe in that first big crook of the tree, because they like to have shade for their young. Osprey don't seem to need that at all. Osprey are always right on top of a light post or, you know, a platform or something like that. Bald eagle nests are usually below the very top of the canopy. And bald eagle nests can be huge. During, you know, part of my career, I did a lot of climbing into nests to band the young, to draw blood and take other samples. And I've said this before, bald eagle nests are about as big as a VW bug. They're huge. They can be 10 feet across. There's been 3 scientists before in one nest, you know, sitting in one nest, and we still had to reach to get to each other. So their nests are huge. They can weigh thousands of pounds. They can be 10, 15, 20 feet deep. You know, they just keep building and building and building on these nests each year. They often have alternate nest sites in their territory. I can remember, I think there were as many as 4 nests in one of the territories on Anderson Ranch Reservoir, and it's thought that as they use these nests, the nests get infested with different types of pests, and so having alternate nests allows them to use a different nest, you know, every couple of years, and that might, you know, clean the old nest out of these pests, and so in that way, you know, that's one of the reasons why it's thought that they have so many alternate nests. But that's common though, that they have alternate nests, and they can live as long as 30 years in captivity. They can breed at 4 to 5 years old. That's about when they start to get their white head too. But as time goes on and as we see these populations increasing and densities increasing, we're also seeing that bald eagles are breeding at later than later. You know, so not 4 or 5 years, maybe 7 or 8 or 10 years now, and it's probably because there just aren't that many nesting sites, you know, as there used to be. So as densities increase, we're seeing that age at first breeding also increase. They lay 2 to 3 eggs. 2 to 3 young are very, very common. You can generally age young bald eagles to what year they are, how old they are, because there's a real predictable progression of molt and feather replacement. So I wanted to mention, you know, up on this table, we've got a few items you guys want to look at, a few show and tell items. There's a young bald eagle wing right there. There's a tail, there's some feathers, a skull. They do mate for life. You hear that all the time. People always ask me that. Do they mate for life? Well, yeah, they mate for life, but they don't have any problem replacing a mate either. You know, if one mate dies, or maybe if one mate, you know, becomes not as good a provider, they can certainly replace a mate. And this reminds me, my wife and I were just talking about this before the story. Loons are another bird that mates for life. And there's a really cool story that's in the UP right now. The oldest known loons, they've had bands on their legs for 25 years, something like that. And there's a pair. They've been together 25 years. And after 25 years, I guess the female chose another male, a younger male. And the two, he chose a younger male, and the two males fought, I guess. So the old male then went away, but came back the next year. The two males fought, and actually the older male broke its bill probably during this altercation, but found another mate. And so I think the verdict is still out. What's the end of the story for this year, Dee? What about the old guy? Nothing.
Bad choice.
You know, you hear about them locking talons and spinning down to the earth. They do that. I've seen that a number of times during my time in the field. And they definitely interact with other species. Bald eagles, it seems like sometimes they would rather steal their prey from ospreys than find it themselves. And I did a number of projects on Cascade Reservoir. Cascade Reservoir, there's a couple hundred osprey nests, you know, in and around Cascade Reservoir. And there's also a dozen or more bald eagle territories on Cascade Reservoir. And those bald eagles, they know exactly where to perch and wait for the ospreys. And those ospreys, when they grab a fish, they try and get back to their nest as fast as they can, because before too long, an eagle will come by and take it. That's called kleptoparasitism.
Yeah, I see that right down here.
Yeah, that's really, really, really common. They do migrate. In the west here, we see a lot of downslope migrations. We see bald eagles, you know, breeding in the upper drainages of these rivers, migrating down to the lower parts of those drainages in the wintertime. They're really trying to find open water, and they're trying to find prey. But they make larger migrations too, like you know, migrations all over the west. And again, it comes down to prey. You know, where are the biggest concentrations of prey, whether it's fish or waterfowl or carrion? That's where you're going to find bald eagles. During my time studying eagles, you know, I saw a number of eagles that had been banded or color marked from as close as the greater Yellowstone ecosystem to as far away as Texas, of all places. So really interesting stuff. So what are some current threats? I mean, I think habitat loss is always a threat. No matter who you are, losing habitat is always a threat. I think another big threat to eagles and all birds of prey is shooting, recreational shooting, and we're finding out more and more and more about that. Even recently, there was a student a few years ago that did a project at Boise State through the master's program in Raptor Biology there, and she found that it's much more common than we would think. And a lot of these raptors that we find underneath power poles that we probably, you know, would have thought they were electrocuted, if you actually look at them and x-ray them, they've been shot. So this is not, it's not going away, and it's maybe increasing even in our culture today, this shooting. And I think it really comes from the disconnect that that people have with the natural world or away from the natural world. I mean, we're just not connected to the natural world anymore. People have a lot of guns in this country. They love to shoot, but they didn't necessarily grow up on a farm. They didn't grow up with that, knowledge of, the connection to nature and connection to the earth. And so I think this is something that's increasing. I think it's a real problem for all raptors, not just bald eagles. But there are diseases. There's this one called AVM. It's a bacteria. It's actually found in aquatic vegetation in the southern states. And this was a real mystery for a number of years, and they finally figured out what it was, that it's a bacteria, and this aquatic vegetation gets eaten by coots in these southern states. Coots are the preferred prey item for bald eagles, and so they were eating the coots, getting this, it's a neurotoxin that they have, and so it killed, hundreds of eagles. But honestly, I think probably the biggest threat now, and it's related to shooting, is lead poisoning. So there's all kinds of lead out there in the environment. This is a species that likes to eat carrion, and so hunters or shooters that are, whether it's plinking at ground squirrels or coyotes, or whether it's, shooting deer or elk with lead bullets, those carcasses are riddled with lead fragments, and bald eagles, not just bald eagles, but birds of prey in general, and especially species that have very acidic digestive systems, like vultures, condors, eagles, are very, very susceptible to lead poisoning. And you pretty much can't find a bald or golden eagle and sample their blood that doesn't have elevated lead levels. And so in my opinion, that's one of the biggest problems that needs to be tackled in the near future. So, and we've known this. We've known this for a long time. In 1991, lead was outlawed In 1991, lead was outlawed for taking migratory game birds. Okay, so that's a long time that we've known lead has been a problem. And we knew lead was a problem for migratory game bird, for waterfowl for a long time. We knew that them picking up lead that had been shot, out of shotguns over marshes, they would pick it up, they think it's gravel, so they use it in their crop to grind their food. And under certain conditions, when they become stressed, like from wintertime, from bad storms, from disease, that lead poisoning affects them. And we knew that waterfowl were dying in huge numbers. But it wasn't until we made the connection that bald eagles were eating these waterfowl with lead in their systems, and the bald eagles were becoming lead poisoned. That's when we stopped using lead ammunition for waterfowl. But we haven't done that for anything else. And I'm not here, I'm a hunter myself. I'm just trying to say this is one of the threats that bald eagles have, for sure. And so, how much time do I have? The best part is yet to come.
Keep going.
So, the best part is I want to tell some stories. Some incredible stories, because I'm so lucky, I think, to have spent my career, working in the field, at least part of it. Now I'm an administrator. But working in the field, I saw so many amazing things related to this work. And one of the stories I want to tell, as we're talking about threats, there are some threats you don't really think of that often, okay? And I tell this to students all the time, younger students that I start working with me, and we're handling birds, we're trapping birds. When you're trapping and handling wildlife, there's always going to be a threat that your actions are going to injure the wildlife, okay? Whether it's a broken wing, a broken leg, or and over my career I've been really, really lucky. I have climbed into nest trees. I've banded, dozens and dozens of young eagles. young goshawks and other species. I've trapped thousands of raptors on migration. Basically, I've handled thousands of birds in my career, and there's always that threat. There's always that threat that something could go wrong. And I mean, I've had very few incidents. I did have a young osprey that we had removed from a platform, and we were about to band it, and it just died in my arms. And that's not a good feeling to have. But back when I was studying eagles, we used to, there was this fellow that I was going to graduate school with. He had learned to climb. He was the climbing expert. He had learned to climb in California and had banded hundreds and hundreds of eagles in California. And there was this nest that I was studying on Anderson Ranch Reservoir. And so we had all the permits and all the permissions and all of that. We climbed into the nest. There were 3 young. It was in this huge Douglas fir tree. We banded the young. One of the young, this nest that's as big as a VW bug, it was clear over to the edge. And when Bob, this was his name, Bob Lehman, he reached over to grab it, it fell off the edge of the nest. It was hanging there, upside down, by its talons. And so he reached over, he grabbed it, pulled it up, we banded it, we set it down, we thought everything was fine. But as we left the nest, we noticed it wasn't standing on one leg. And we, gave it a closer inspection, and we found out that indeed, probably when he pulled it over, the edge of the nest, the leg had broken. So we weren't sure what to do. We left it in the nest. We went down. We immediately called the Fish and Wildlife Service. That's who had issued us the permits. We told them what had happened. They said, here's a vet. Call this vet. We asked the vet what to do, and the vet said, well, the leg needs to be set. So you need to climb back into that nest, get the nestling, which we did. We lowered it down. We put it in a crate. We took it to the vet. The vet put a pin in the leg. So it was this bone, and the vet left the pin sticking out. And the vet said, here's what I did. I put a pin in the leg. The bone's gonna set, in a few days, maybe in 2 weeks, you can remove the pin. The best thing to do is put the bird back in the nest. And we agreed. So this leg was set. We climbed this tree again, put it back in the nest. Came home. I was watching the nest every day, and so the bird was fine. It was being fed. It was the biggest youngster in the nest. And 2 weeks later, Bob and I climbed back in the tree. The rod that was in the leg was threaded, and so all we had to do was unthread the rod. We slid it out like this. The bird was fine. It was standing on the leg. It had bands on its legs. It was fine. It was fine. And so I think I went home for the weekend or something like that. And I came back on Monday, and I went to my observation point, which was about a mile away across the lake, and I set up my telescope, and I looked, and I looked. I said, where's that nest tree? Where's the nest? No. And I couldn't find the nest. I couldn't find the nest tree. So I drove over there in the boat, and I walked up the hill, and I'll be darned, the nest tree fell over. Oh. This was 2 days after we had been climbing up in the nest for the 4th time. And this tree was huge. It was, we didn't cause this, I guarantee you. But the bole on this nest tree was at least 6 or 7 feet across. And when we looked at it, it had about this much good wood. Yeah. And the rest of it, all the way across, was completely rotten. And that bird was alive. So one of the 3 wasn't. As the tree fell, it must have gotten smashed or hit. I don't know. But one of the youngsters was dead, and the other 2 were on the shore. And the one that we had fixed the leg on, that one was still alive, and I watched it for the next few weeks, and it had been fed by its, by its parents, and it left. It fledged, and so that's a threat you don't think of very often, right? So there's another one. There was another one that I was watching just outside of McCall. Same thing. I had an observation point, and it was, half a mile or so, and this nest was going great. There were 2 young in this nest tree, and I, went home for the weekend or something and came back, and it looked like carnage. And I couldn't figure out what the deal was. I looked in the nest. The young eagles were not in the nest, and I followed the tree down, and there they were hanging from branches. These are kind of gruesome stories, I'm sorry. But the youngsters were dead. And so I walked up. I thought, what's going on? Was it a bear? Or did somebody shoot them? What's going on? And I walked up, and the tree had been struck by lightning. Struck by lightning, electrocuted the youngsters, blew them out of the nest, apparently, but yet they probably weren't dead yet and were like clinging and grasping to branches. So when does that ever happen? A tree gets struck by lightning. And that's actually the second time in my career I've seen that, during a ferruginous hawk study that I did down near Raft River. A tree was struck by lightning, and all of the youngsters were dead. The tree was blown up. So I guess it happens. But I've been really, really fortunate to see some, really cool things in my career. Like I say, Anderson Ranch Reservoir was one of the places I worked a lot, and I had these observation points in this. The technology at the time was a big telescope. It was called a Questar telescope, and it was designed to look at stars, really. I think it had 200 or 180 or 200 power magnification. And it had 2 or 3 settings. You had to start at the low setting to find the nest tree, and then you turned it up to the medium setting, and then you had to have the nest in exactly the right spot in the view when you turned it up to the 200 power. And from a mile away, you could see what kind of fish they were eating. If the air was clear, if the air was clear, you could see what kind of fish they were eating. You could see the interactions among the youngsters, the interactions among the adults. And I really, over my years, I saw some really cool interactions and behavioral observations. And still, to this day, I want to, I think about this a lot, that I would love to apologize to that young couple that I saw on the boat that were up in the back end of that cove. And I would recognize that tattoo anyway if I saw it. So I apologize when I was panning across to get to the nest. Sorry about that. If you're in the audience, I apologize.
Cover up that tattoo.
Anderson was a great place. There was a big deer migration, and I actually would see deer very often, in the early spring, crossing the reservoir, actually swimming across. And one day, I used a boat to get to my observation point, and there was something swimming across. It wasn't a deer. And as I got closer, I realized it was a bear. It was the biggest, fattest black bear I had ever seen. And I watched it, get out and roll, it didn't run, it rolled up the hill as fast as it could, never even stopped to shake. And a couple days later, there was another animal swimming across the reservoir, and I got a little closer, and it was a mountain lion. And I've been fortunate in my life and career. I've seen about half a dozen mountain lions, but that one I saw away from me to you. I waited till it almost got to shore, and I got up a little closer to get a photo, and it jumped out, and that thing didn't stop. It went 200 yards without shaking. It took 2 seconds, I think, to get 200 yards. So when I was doing my work in the upper Boise River drainage, I was surveying from the air. And this project was funded by the Forest Service, and so we used both fixed wing and helicopters. And you know, the upper Boise drainage is tight and narrow and twisting and turning. The South Fork in particular is very, it's a canyon. And so for biologists, I think it's true that the #1 cause of death among biologists is crashing in airplanes. And so it's very common, very common. And so one day I was on the South Fork of the Boise in a helicopter going up through this canyon, and I could see the expression change on the pilot's face, and he went from, you know, flush to white, and he stopped the helicopter. You know, it just stopped. And I looked over and I said, "What's going on?" And he said, "You should go buy a lottery ticket." I said, "Why?" And he said, "Look out your window." And so I looked out the window, and we were above an old telegraph wire that wasn't marked, and you could see it on both sides of the helicopter going up to the canyon rim, and we were 20 yards from it on either side of the rotors. So definitely that aerial survey work. There was another time we came around a corner and a huge wind turned the helicopter around, like did a 180. So to this day, I don't like to fly in small planes. One of the guys who flew us, this was interesting. You can't make a living, I guess you can, but being a pilot, you know, for bald eagle surveys. And so this guy's day job was he flew government gunners around to shoot coyotes. This is the craziest story. He had a little Piper Cub, which is a super small light aircraft. They were used during World War II, you know, for surveillance. They have the fuselage is canvas, so they're super light. And this guy would fly these gunners around to shoot coyotes out, you know, down in the valley where there were big concentrations of livestock. And he was kind of crazy, honestly. And when we would see a coyote maybe running across the reservoir or on a ridge, he would go from already really low and go like this, and we would get like 10 yards off the ground, and he would say, "Okay, well, now's about when when they would shoot it." And there were bullet holes in the plane from where these gunners would shoot down to shoot these poor coyotes, and then the bullets would bounce back and hit the plane. That guy was crazy. And we saw another mountain lion that was, as we were going over it, ran up the top of a tree, a short tree. And that guy turned and said, "There's a mountain lion." And he came, and we were doing a 180 like this, you know, as tight as you can turn a plane. And he was trying to point out this mountain lion, and all I could see was the bag in front of my face. Okay? I finally saw the mountain lion, and I said, "Okay, let's go." But so funny stories like that. But I'm honestly, I can tell you're all get tired of my stories. But overall, I mean, I've had a really rewarding career, and it's not over as a biologist, but anymore I get the most reward, I think, from working with students, from mentoring, from teaching, and from training. But I sure love working with those bald eagles. I love those days, and I think about them. I had a lot of fun putting this together, and I especially liked looking through that scope and watching their interactions, watching what they did. I was a mile away. They had no idea I was there. And you see the craziest things that they do and the craziest interactions between them and other wildlife that you would never expect. So that was a lot of fun. But anyway, thanks you guys for coming.
Feel free to ask questions before we wrap up. So, anybody have any questions?
Yeah, you have covered a lot of ground, a lot of topics, wonderful in education. But I didn't quite get the picture on the routes. Would like the Salmon River be a route, or what?
Yeah.
A route?
Yeah, so these are for these midwinter bald eagle surveys. And so like you say, the Salmon River probably has a number of routes. And then each of those routes is divided up into different surveys.
Are these human routes or eagle routes?
They're human routes. They're survey
Okay,
routes.
survey routes.
They're survey routes. And they're basically what you can survey in a few hours, you know.
Nice.
And so the idea is that it's a collaboration between agencies, state and federal, universities, nonprofit organizations, individuals. A lot of Audubon folks help with things, you know, with these midwinter surveys, and it's coordinated. So you're supposed to all be out there on the same day at the same time, getting a count.
So,
Yeah. Sorry about that.
it's like a Christmas count, right? Happens after Christmas.
It's like a Christmas
It's
bird
like-
count. It
yeah.
happens after Christmas.
Yeah.
But yeah, yep, midwinter. Yes, sir.
We see osprey fishing all the time, and the eagle's just downstream. I've never seen the eagle fish. How does he get his fish?
From the osprey.
Is it just entirely?
No, it's not entirely, but it almost seems to me like they think that's more fun. but the eagles, osprey and eagles are different. Ospreys can actually dive in the water. Eagles usually take their prey off the top, and eagles are much more prone. They're much more prone to take dead prey, so a dead fish, you know, that might be on the side or floating on the surface as well. But if you watch, you'll see them take prey, though. Yeah. John.
Were Alaskan eagles affected by DDT to the extent of other North American eagles?
They were not to the extent of the lower 48. And Alaskan eagles, you know, there's always been huge numbers up there. They were not listed, you know, those populations were not listed. It was only the conterminous, you know, lower 48 states where eagles were listed. Back there.
Yeah, we have a place on Valley Creek on a bluff, and usually during the summer we just see many bald eagles. This summer we haven't seen nearly as many, and I wondered if it had anything to do with whether it's climate change, whether it's smoke, a combination of all that, what it might be.
It could be. I honestly can't, you know, say. But yeah, I think, you know, they move around from year to year. Maybe that territory isn't occupied this year. Maybe they lost one of the pair or something like that. So it's really hard to say. Climate change is definitely affecting eagles. It's affecting, you know, where there's open water. There's more and more open water. So I think they're more spread out during the winter time, but there's definitely more nests. The state of Idaho used to track how many nests there were. They don't do that anymore, but there's hundreds of nests now, and more every year, you know, showing up.
We've seen more successful osprey this year trailed up from Valley Creek than we ever have.
Wow.
So it's just, in view of what you said earlier, that's kind of interesting.
I was just banding on.
That opportunity.
I was just banding osprey on Cascade a couple of weekends ago, and I've never seen so many osprey. And so, you know, each nest had 3. One nest had 4 young osprey. So it's a great year for osprey, at least.
Yeah.
I don't know about bald eagles. You had a question? Yeah.
What about Roundup?
What about
Roundup?
The chemical.
The chemical Roundup?
Roundup?
Herbicides.
You know, I did a little research before the talk, and I didn't see anything about Roundup specifically, you know, being a threat. So I could look into it a little more, but yeah, I didn't necessarily see that as being a threat. That one. Yeah.
You commented about the number of nesting pair in Idaho. Do you have any notion or any estimate of how many eagles we have in Idaho? Just curious.
I don't. Well, I don't. There's a paper that I have in my bag that talks about the winter, you know, the winter counts and the but as far as nesting pairs, I don't. I looked.
214.
Oh, nests.
As of 2000, I think the last big count was in 2012. So it's been a number of
Yeah,
years.
so it's probably double that now,
Yeah, we
honestly.
have quite a few up here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because they're recovered and because they're not, the populations are threatened. The state of Idaho is no longer doing these big surveys to see how they're doing. So they're recovered, the populations are good, so that's why the last known count was in 2012. We've been into that, so.
Thank you.
You said they sort of took them off the Endangered Species Act with about like 10,000 nesting pairs. What are some of the factors that go into like that number and making that determination of like that's enough?
So in the beginning, they create this recovery plan, and they actually set recovery goals for the species. And so the way the system is supposed to work, you know, is when that species reaches those recovery goals, and sometimes it's done by region, sometimes it's done by zone, so they may reach recovery goals in one region and not another, but that's the way it's supposed to work, is that when, you know, when they reach those recovery goals that are set before that, then, you know, then they're, you know, the process starts to remove them.
I'm sure there's a lot of factors that go into figuring out those recovery goals.
Yes, yeah, there's a lot of modeling, population modeling, and, you know, really a panel of experts gets together and, you know, and produces those recovery plans.